Edward Teller's story begins far from the desert landscapes that would later witness the dawn of nuclear fire. He was born in 1908 in Budapest, Hungary, into a Jewish family that was part of the cultured, yet anxious middle class of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. His parents regarded education as essential to their well-being, a true lifeline. Budapest at that time was a vibrant city known for its cafes, music scene, mathematical prowess, and underlying political tensions, an elegant place with a palpable nervous energy. Growing up in this environment, Teller learned two key lessons early on: the beauty of ideas and the potential brutality of history. As a boy, he displayed exceptional intelligence but wasn't one for theatrics. He was drawn to numbers with the same enthusiasm that other children had for games. At the Lutheran Gymnasium, one of Hungary's most prestigious schools, he shared classrooms with future luminaries like John von Neumann, who was a few years ahead, and Eugene Wigner, who moved in similar intellectual circles. The young Teller enjoyed puzzles, but he also craved certainty. Physics, with its promise of definitive answers achievable through disciplined study, seemed to offer both. In 1926, like many bright Central European minds, seeking the cutting edge of science, he left Hungary for Germany. He initially studied chemical engineering, then transitioned to physics, moving between Karlsruhe, Munich, and Leipzig. His wandering path mirrored a Europe adrift, unsure of its future. Germany was still reeling from the aftermath of World War I. Hungary bore the scars of revolution and counter-revolution, and anti-Semitism was a growing malignancy. Teller sensed this unease, even if he didn't fully grasp its implications yet. He immersed himself in equations, but history was already looming over him. Then came the accident that physically altered him and perhaps strengthened his resolve. In Munich, he was struck by a streetcar, severely injuring his right foot, which eventually required amputation below the knee. He lived the rest of his life with a prosthetic. Friends later noted that this event seemed to deepen his inherent toughness. Teller rarely spoke of the pain he endured, but afterward, he carried a certain steely edge, as if he learned early on that reality is unyielding. Leipzig in the late 1920s was the epicenter of quantum mechanics. Teller became a student of Werner Heisenberg, one of the pioneers of this new physics. This was a time when atoms ceased to be viewed as miniature solar systems, and instead were understood as probabilistic entities. Teller thrived in this environment. His mind was quick and geometrically inclined. He had a knack for understanding how abstract principles could lead to tangible predictions. He authored papers on molecular structure, quantum chemistry, and what later became known as the John Teller effect, the subtle yet predictable ways in which the symmetry of molecules can be broken. Even in his earliest work, one could observe Teller's characteristic style, an impatience with ambiguity, a relentless pursuit of underlying mechanisms, and a willingness to push a problem until a clear solution emerged. But as a scientific career blossomed, Europe grew darker. Hitler rose to power in 1933. For a Jewish Hungarian physicist in Germany, the writing was on the wall. There was no future to build, only a future to escape. Teller fled to Copenhagen, finding refuge at Niels Bohr's Institute, which had become a haven for brilliant exiles. Denmark offered safety and stimulating intellectual discourse. Bohr's Institute was a vibrant hub where the core elements of modern physics were constantly being explored and debated. Teller was among the many young scientists who spent those years arguing, calculating, and contemplating, all while half aware of the looming storm that threatened to shatter their world. In 1935, he moved again, this time to the United States. This transition was more than just a change of location. In America, physics was evolving from a European intellectual pursuit into a global industrial force. Teller accepted a position at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and began collaborating with another refugee physicist, George Gamow. Together, they investigated nuclear processes, including theories about how stars generate energy. Teller's early years in America were still primarily academic, focused on the kind of theoretical questions that produce chalk dust rather than front-page news. Then, the world's patience for pure theory ran out. In 1939, news broke that uranium could undergo fission, releasing an incredible amount of energy. That same year, war erupted in Europe. Many refugee scientists felt a bitter irony. They had escaped fascism, but their families, friends, and homelands were now in its grasp. Teller shared this sentiment. He harbored a deep fear that Nazi Germany would achieve scientific supremacy, a fear that quickly solidified into a political conviction. If Hitler acquired an atomic bomb, the world might never recover. So, when the Manhattan Project was launched to develop the first nuclear weapon, Teller joined. In 1942, he arrived at the new laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, a secluded mesa transformed into a clandestine city of secrecy and genius. The project was led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, whose temperament was in stark contrast to Teller's. Oppenheimer was known for his poetic nature, broad knowledge, and leadership style based on charisma and conversation. Teller, on the other hand, was sharp, intense, and often independent. While Oppenheimer appreciated the symphony of ideas, Teller preferred the solo that cut through the noise. Nevertheless, the early years at Los Alamos were electrifying. Physicists, chemists, and engineers, many still in their 30s, were tackling an unprecedented challenge: how to harness fission to create a weapon. Teller contributed to the core bomb design, studying shock waves and neutron behavior. Yet, even as the atomic bomb project remained unresolved, his imagination raced ahead. He was already preoccupied with a second question. If fission could create a bomb, could fusion, the hydrogen-burning process that powers stars, create something far more powerful? This wasn't just a passing thought. Teller had been considering fusion weapons since 1941. By the time he arrived at Los Alamos, he was pushing the idea as a parallel project to the atomic bomb. His colleagues listened, sometimes fascinated, sometimes wearily. The fission bomb was challenging enough. The war demanded immediate attention. Why pursue such an ambitious dream? Teller didn't see it as a dream. He saw it as the next logical step, perhaps the only step that could ensure deterrence if other nations acquired nuclear weapons. There was also an emotional element at play. Teller was a man shaped by exile. He had witnessed his continent descend into barbarism. He didn't believe that history was gentle. In his view, power was paramount because power determined survival. If someone might build a super bomb, he wanted the United States to build it first. Not because he desired destruction, he argued, but because he feared the consequences if it fell into the wrong hands alone. At Los Alamos, this perspective sometimes made him an outsider. His impatience with the slow, methodical pace of the atomic project could frustrate his colleagues. He occasionally clashed with Oppenheimer, who was focused on completing the fission bomb and skeptical about the feasibility of a hydrogen bomb during wartime. Nevertheless, Oppenheimer recognized Teller's brilliance and kept him involved in critical aspects of the project. In July 1945, the Trinity tests in the New Mexico desert proved that the atomic bomb worked. A month later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the war to an end and ushered in the nuclear age. For many scientists, the moment was a mix of triumph and horror. Teller's reaction was complex. He understood the implications of what had happened, understood the human cost, but didn't succumb to regret as some of his colleagues did. Instead, the end of the war strengthened his conviction that fusion weapons were the next strategic imperative. The Soviet Union was no longer the ally that wartime politics had suggested. Europe was in ruins. In Teller's eyes, a new, colder conflict was already brewing. Part 1 concludes here, with Teller standing at a historical crossroads. He has arrived in America as a refugee scholar, helped develop the first atomic bomb, and is already envisioning a more terrifying weapon. The hydrogen bomb exists in his mind as a distinct possibility, almost a predetermined outcome. Whether that destiny becomes reality, and what kind of person Teller will become as he attempts to bring it into existence, is the story of the next part. Part 2 will cover the early Cold War years, Teller's campaign for the super, his battles within the scientific community, and the moment fusion weapons transitioned from theoretical concept to national priority. The war ended, but Edward Teller didn't experience the sense of peace that many Americans imagined in 1945. For him, victory hadn't closed a chapter. It had opened a new one. He had helped create a weapon unlike any civilization had ever possessed. And almost immediately he became convinced that the next weapon would be larger, faster, and needed sooner than anyone was willing to acknowledge. The atomic bomb wasn't the ultimate defense. It was just the first step on a staircase that could climb indefinitely. The early Cold War solidified this belief. In Washington and within the newly established nuclear community, the atmosphere quickly shifted from wartime urgency to post-war rivalry. The Soviet Union was no longer a partner. It was a competitor with its own brilliant scientists, its own wounded pride, and an insatiable need for security. Teller watched as geopolitical tensions escalated and arrived at a simple, almost stark conclusion. If the Soviets developed a fusion bomb first, the balance of power could shift in a way that might destroy democracy itself. So, he began to advocate for what he called the super, a hydrogen bomb based on nuclear fusion. This wasn't merely a scientific endeavor for him. It was a moral mission shaped by his experience as an exile. Teller had fled a Europe that had collapsed because power had fallen into the wrong hands. To him, deterrence wasn't an abstract strategic concept. It was a promise that the horrors of the 1930s wouldn't be repeated on a global scale. However, the scientific path to the super was unclear. Fusion bombs were far more complex than fission bombs. In theory, if hydrogen isotopes could be compressed and heated sufficiently, they would fuse and release energy, much like the core of a star. In practice, no one had devised a stable design that could reliably ignite fusion. The initial classical super that Teller envisioned was elegant on paper, but stubbornly unworkable. It involved a long tube of liquid deuterium, triggered by a fission bomb, in the hope that a fusion reaction would propagate down the tube. Calculations suggested that the reaction would fizzle out before it could sustain itself. The idea straddled the line between genius and fantasy. Within the scientific community, skepticism grew. Many of Teller's colleagues at Los Alamos felt burdened by the moral implications of Hiroshima. They had built atomic bombs to stop Hitler. Now that Hitler was gone, should they pursue something even more destructive? Robert Oppenheimer, appointed to chair the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, became the most influential voice of dissent. Oppenheimer wasn't naive about the Soviet threat, but he feared that a hydrogen bomb would be a weapon of mass slaughter, morally indefensible and politically destabilizing. He recommended against an all-out crash program. The committee supported him. Teller viewed this recommendation as a betrayal of reality. He had clashed with Oppenheimer during the war over priorities. Now, the conflict became fundamental. Oppenheimer spoke as a guardian of civilization's conscience. Teller spoke as a guardian of civilization's survival. Their disagreement wasn't merely technical. It was about the kind of world they believed they inhabited. Then, in August 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. The news shook the United States to its core. The nuclear monopoly had ended far sooner than Americans had anticipated. Fear gripped the White House, Congress, the Pentagon, and the public. For Teller, this moment felt like proof transforming into prophecy. He went to Washington, argued relentlessly, and found a political climate that was finally receptive to his message. President Harry Truman announced in early 1950 that the U.S. would pursue the hydrogen bomb. The super was now national policy. But policy didn't equate to a viable design. Los Alamos scientists still struggled to make fusion work. Teller was frustrated by what he perceived as institutional caution. He believed that the laboratory had become too comfortable, too slow, too uncertain in its resolve. Some colleagues felt he was obsessed. Others felt he was correct and was simply articulating the strategic imperative. Regardless, Teller became a restless force within the lab. A man who couldn't stop thinking about the next step, even when the current one remained precarious. The breakthrough came through a partnership that history would forever intertwine. Teller and Stanislaw Ulam. Ulam, a Polish-born mathematician, proposed a new approach in 1951. Use the energy of fission explosion not just as a heat source, but as a means of compression. Instead of hoping that fusion would ignite in an extended tube, you would first implode the fusion fuel to an extreme density, then ignite it. Teller seized upon this idea and added his own crucial refinement. Radiation from a primary fission bomb could be used to efficiently compress a secondary fusion stage. The design, later called the Teller-Ulam configuration, marked the true birth of a workable hydrogen bomb. To Teller, the moment felt like vindication. Years of relentless effort had finally opened a door. He worked feverishly to translate the concept into a physical device. Engineering challenges remained. Cryogenic fuel, staging, time and materials, but the underlying physics was now sound. In November 1952, the United States tested the first thermonuclear device, Ivy Mike, in the Marshall Islands. It wasn't yet a deployable weapon. It was a massive experimental machine. Still, when the fireball erupted, the message was undeniable. The yield was approximately 10 megatons, hundreds of times greater than Hiroshima. An entire island was vaporized. The mushroom cloud ascended into the sky like a new, terrifying form of weather. The world had entered a second, even more frightening nuclear age. Teller was jubilant, not in a cartoonish, bloodthirsty way, but in the intense way a man feels when a dangerous prediction he has championed becomes reality. Colleagues described him as energized, almost relieved. To him, the super was now a fact of deterrence. He believed it would prevent war, not cause it. Yet, even some friends could sense a chill beneath the triumph. If such power existed, history might not be stable enough to contain it safely. After Ivy Mike, the hydrogen bomb became smaller, lighter, and deliverable. The Soviets quickly followed suit with their own thermonuclear tests. The arms race escalated like a wildfire feeding on its own heat. Teller, now publicly known as the father of the H-bomb, stepped into a role that blended science, politics, and public advocacy. He argued for more bombs, better missiles, and stronger missile defense. He supported nuclear testing, believing that technological superiority was the only true guarantee of peace. He was already thinking beyond fission and fusion toward how nuclear explosives could be used in engineering, even in space. Teller's imagination always ran ahead of the world's comfort level, but this very drive cost him trust within parts of the scientific community. Many Los Alamos colleagues felt he had become too political, too quick to equate dissent with weakness. Some believed he exaggerated the Soviet threat. Others believed he underestimated the moral implications of what he was helping to create. The rift that formed around the hydrogen bomb would follow Teller for the rest of his life, shaping his reputation into something both admired and feared. At the heart of that rift was a question that defied a simple equation. What does responsibility look like when you possess the ability to end the world? Teller's answer was consistent with his life story. He had witnessed the failure of Europe's democracies. He had seen what happens when free societies underestimate violent regimes. So he embraced a grim conclusion. If peace depended on terror, then that terror must be in the hands of those who feared tyranny the most. It was a bleak logic, but for Teller, it wasn't cynical. It was about survival. Part 2 concludes with the hydrogen bomb no longer a theory but a weapon, and Teller no longer just a physicist, but a symbol in the Cold War. He has won the battle for super, but in doing so, he has stepped into a moral maelstrom that will reshape his friendships, his standing, and his place in history. Part 3 will follow the next turn. Teller's departure from Los Alamos, his founding role at Livermore, and the controversy that erupted when he testified against Oppenheimer, turning a scientific rivalry into a national drama. The hydrogen bomb made Edward Teller famous, but also left him subtly displaced. After Ivy Mike, he discovered that winning a strategic argument could isolate you from the very community you had helped protect. Los Alamos, once a frontier of shared purpose, began to feel to Teller like a place where people wanted to slow down precisely when he thought the race had just begun. He was no longer simply a physicist tackling a difficult problem. He had become a symbol in a moral debate, and symbols rarely feel at ease in the rooms where they were created. Teller's frustration grew throughout 1953 and 1954. He felt that the Los Alamos leadership was too cautious about thermonuclear development, too hesitant about weaponization, and unwilling to move at the pace the Cold War demanded. Many colleagues felt the opposite, that Teller had become too fixated, treating any hesitation as weakness and any ethical concern as an impediment. The old wartime camaraderie was fracturing into factions, some based on strategy, some on conscience, and most on a combination of both. Out of this division emerged a new institution, and Teller would become one of its key architects. In 1952, the U.S. government decided to establish a second nuclear weapons laboratory to compete with Los Alamos and accelerate innovation. The site was Livermore, California. Officially, it was called the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, later Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Unofficially, it was Teller's escape hatch in his engine. He believed that competition would prevent complacency. He believed that new minds and new management could push thermonuclear work faster, cleaner, and more aggressively. He recruited talented younger physicists, assembled teams with a startup-like urgency, and dedicated his energy to transforming Livermore into a place where the future was always expected yesterday. Livermore's early years were chaotic. Some designs failed. Some tests were disappointing. Los Alamos veterans quipped that Livermore was a lab built on Teller's impatience. But Teller thrived in the chaos. He enjoyed tight deadlines, vigorous disagreements, and the sense that physics mattered because history was watching. If Los Alamos felt like an institution learning to hesitate, Livermore felt like a laboratory learning to sprint. Then came the event that defined Teller's public image more than any technical paper ever could, the Oppenheimer security hearing of 1954. Oppenheimer, once the charismatic leader of Los Alamos, had become a central figure in the post-war nuclear establishment. He chaired the General Advisory Committee, advised presidents, and possessed moral authority as the father of the atomic bomb. However, he had also opposed the hydrogen bomb crash program and had a complicated political history. Associations with left-wing circles in the 1930s, friends who had been communists, and a personality that often irritated more rigid security officials. In the climate of McCarthy-era fear, these facts became ammunition. The government moved to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance. The hearing was ostensibly about loyalty and risk, but everyone understood that it was also about policy and power. If Oppenheimer fell, the path would be cleared for a more militarized, thermonuclear-first strategy. If he survived, skepticism about endless escalation might maintain its foothold within the establishment. Teller was called to testify. What transpired there became one of the most painful episodes in American scientific history. Teller didn't accuse Oppenheimer of being a spy. He didn't claim that Oppenheimer was disloyal. He said something colder and, in its own way, more devastating. That he didn't trust Oppenheimer's judgment in matters of national security, and that he would feel more secure if decisions were made without Oppenheimer's influence. In a courtroom already biased against Oppenheimer, those words landed like a final blow. Oppenheimer lost his clearance. His career in government service ended. And Teller, though he had spoken from his own sense of strategic necessity, became almost instantly the man who had publicly turned against a colleague who had once led them all through war. The backlash was intense. Many physicists viewed Teller's testimony as a betrayal of scientific solidarity and due process. Some refused to speak to him at conferences. Others wouldn't shake his hand. In their eyes, he had collaborated with a political witch hunt that threatened the independence of science itself. Even those who privately agreed with Teller's strategic views often felt that he had crossed a moral boundary in how he expressed them. Teller didn't apologize. He wasn't inclined to back down. He believed he had spoken the truth as he saw it. He believed that Oppenheimer's influence had hindered the hydrogen project at a time when delay could have been catastrophic. And he believed that in war, hot or cold, judgment was everything. If he distrusted someone's judgment, he felt compelled to say so, regardless of the consequences. Yet, the consequences changed his life. From 1954 onward, Teller became an anomaly, celebrated by segments of the political and military establishment, yet ostracized within much of the physics community. He was invited to the White House. He briefed generals. He became a public advocate for nuclear strength. At the same time, he walked into scientific gatherings where conversations hushed, where smiles were polite but strained. It was as if he had traded membership in a tribe of colleagues for membership in a tribe of strategists. He embraced his new role. During the late 1950s, Teller pushed hard for advanced thermonuclear weapons, for missile systems capable of delivering them, and for continued nuclear testing. He argued against test bans, asserting that halting tests would leave the U.S. vulnerable while the Soviets might continue covertly. He became a vocal proponent of civil defense and of the idea that technology could mitigate strategic risk. Where others saw a nuclear arms race as a dangerous spiral, Teller saw it as a necessity to prevent the spiral from leading to tyranny. At Livermore, he oversaw teams developing lighter, more efficient hydrogen bombs, warheads for intercontinental ballistic missiles, and concepts that blurred the line between scientific research and deterrence engineering. Some projects were spectacularly successful, others failed quietly, but Teller's influence on the lab's culture was unmistakable. Boldness, speed, and almost unwavering belief that America couldn't afford to fall behind. Still, beneath his political armor, there was a human cost he rarely acknowledged. He missed the camaraderie of the old Los Alamos days, even if he wouldn't admit it. He missed being liked by the people he respected intellectually. The Oppenheimer affair made him famous, but it also made him lonely. Those close to him noticed that he became more combative in public, more sentimental in private. His humor became sharper. His certainty hardened. The exile who had once feared history's cruelty now found himself living a new kind of exile, a social one, created by his own choices. And yet, from Teller's perspective, the world was validating his fears. The Soviets tested larger bombs. Missile technology advanced. Berlin crises, proxy wars, and nuclear brinkmanship made the 1950s feel like a decade balanced on a knife's edge. Teller didn't believe that the Cold War would be won through restraint. He believed it would be survived through superiority. Part 3 concludes with Teller standing in that complicated place, a founder of Livermore, a strategic hawk, a scientific pariah to some, and a hero to others. He has helped unleash the hydrogen age and paid a personal price for insisting on it. The question now is what he does with that influence as the Cold War intensifies, and how far he will go in pursuit of a technological shield against fear. Part 4 will follow Teller into the coming decades. His role in nuclear policy, his controversial push for missile defense and Star Wars, and how his faith in American technological salvation shaped his legacy and his critics. The years following the Oppenheimer hearing did not mellow Edward Teller. If anything, they sharpened. He had chosen a path that, while costing him camaraderie within the physics community, granted him access to the inner circles of American power. By the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, Edward Teller transcended his role as a mere architect of thermonuclear weapons. He evolved into something far more unique and controversial, a scientist who felt obligated to mold national strategy, not just equip it with tools. At Livermore, his influence remained paramount. Even after he relinquished his directorship in 1960, he stepped down in part to be able to lobby more effectively in Washington, where the debate over nuclear testing was reaching fever pitch. Teller considered test bans a perilous illusion, arguing that without continued testing, the United States would forfeit its technical edge, and that verification measures were too unreliable to prevent Soviet duplicity. This position pitted him against numerous colleagues who were increasingly alarmed by the dangers of radioactive fallout and the escalating arms race. When the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed in 1963, prohibiting tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, Teller publicly opposed it, viewing it not as a moral victory, but as a strategic liability. Around this time, Teller championed an idea that revealed another facet of his imaginative mind, the concept of peaceful nuclear explosions. He became a prominent advocate for Project Plowshare, a federal initiative that sought to harness nuclear blasts for large-scale civil engineering projects, such as digging canals, creating harbors, and tapping into underground gas reserves. Teller's most well-known proposal in this vein was Project Chariot, which envisioned using thermonuclear devices to construct a deep-water harbor in Alaska. To him, this was a remarkable demonstration of technology transforming destruction into constructive utility. However, critics saw it as a reckless, naive endeavor that disregarded ecological and human consequences. Local communities and scientists protested the plan, and it was ultimately abandoned. Project Plowshare itself gradually lost momentum as the environmental damage and economic impracticality became undeniable. Teller took this failure personally, but remained steadfast in his belief that nuclear energy, when properly channeled, could be a powerful force for progress. This conviction shaped his advocacy for nuclear power. Teller contended that civilian nuclear reactors were essential for modern prosperity and could reduce reliance on fossil fuels. He also contributed to reactor safety standards and championed designs, such as Triga research reactors, that prioritize stability and resistance to meltdowns. While some perceived nuclear technology as the embodiment of danger, Teller viewed it as a neutral force whose morality depended on those who wielded it. Yet, even as he defended peaceful nuclear applications, deterrence remained his primary focus. The 1960s and 70s were decades of Cold War turmoil, marked by Berlin crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the proliferation of intercontinental missiles, and the chilling calculus of mutually assured destruction. Teller's worldview was straightforward and somber. Peace would not arise from goodwill, but from credibility, which required superiority, or at least a demonstrable capacity to survive and retaliate. Consequently, he persistently advocated for stronger arsenals, improved delivery systems, and research into defenses that could diminish reliance on sheer retaliation. He advised presidents and Pentagon officials, served on committees, and became a tireless public speaker. Despite lacking warmth in personal relationships, he possessed a talent for theatrical clarity in political discourse, capable of transforming a technical concept into a moral imperative with a few incisive sentences. To his supporters, this made him a prophet of realism, while to his critics, it made him a purveyor of fear. By the late 1970s, the strategic landscape shifted once again. The Soviet Union deployed new missile systems, and American confidence in deterrence alone began to waver. Teller's response, which had been developing for years, was defense, not just retaliation. He believed that if missiles could be intercepted, if a shield could mitigate the threat, the world might escape the hostage situation of mutual destruction. This idea propelled him into the most controversial chapter of his later life, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. In the early 1980s, Teller found a receptive audience in President Ronald Reagan, who had long been wary of a world living under a perpetual nuclear threat. Teller and his colleagues at Livermore proposed advanced missile defense concepts using space-based systems, including lasers, particle beams, and most notably, an experimental X-ray laser triggered by nuclear explosions, known as Project Excalibur. The vision was ambitious. A multi-layered shield that could destroy incoming Soviet ICBMs before they reached American soil. In 1983, Reagan announced SDI to the world. Supporters hailed it as a pathway beyond mutually assured destruction, while critics derided it as Star Wars, a fantasy rooted in science fiction rather than sound physics. Teller became SDI's most recognizable scientific champion. Touring Washington, testifying before Congress, granting interviews, and depicting scenarios of defensive salvation with almost religious zeal, except his religion was technology. However, controversy quickly ensued. Many scientists doubted that SDI could function reliably against real-world countermeasures. Some accused Teller of exaggerating feasibility to cater to political agendas. A public dispute erupted after internal reviews suggested that key claims about the X-ray laser were overly optimistic. Critics quipped about measuring the disparity between promise and reality in Teller's. Stung by these criticisms, Teller insisted that ambitious research always seems impossible at the outset, and abandoning it would be the true irresponsibility. The debate over SDI was not merely technical, but also philosophical. Teller believed that defense research could shift the moral core of nuclear policy from threatening cities to protecting them. His opponents argued that SDI risked destabilizing deterrence, prompting the Soviets to build more missiles or launch a preemptive strike before the shield was fully operational. The argument exposed the same fault line that had divided Teller and Oppenheimer decades earlier. Survival through strength versus restraint through fear of escalation. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Teller remained politically engaged, joining advisory councils, writing essays, and continuing to argue that American technological dynamism was the best safeguard against authoritarian surprise. He celebrated the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe as evidence that history could be influenced by pressure and perseverance. After 1989, he visited Hungary, expressing a blend of pride and sorrow about the country he had left as a young man. Although age began to take its toll on him physically, his rhetorical fervor remained undiminished. He resided in California, maintaining ties to Livermore as Director Emeritus and to Stanford's Hoover Institution as a senior fellow, continuing to deliver speeches with the same sharp edge, sometimes tempered by a late-life gentleness toward students. Honors accumulated, including the Enrico Fermi Award the Einstein Award, and finally, the Presidential Medal of Freedom shortly before his death. Yet, the question of whether he was protector or an accelerant continued to haunt his legacy. Admirers credited Teller with preventing the Cold War from escalating into a hot war, arguing that his push for thermonuclear superiority and missile defense forced the Soviets to confront their limitations and made aggression too costly. Critics contended that he pushed the world closer to catastrophe, normalizing ever larger weapons and promoting defenses that could trigger destabilizing arms races. The truth is complex, as history itself is complex. Teller lived in a century where the line between preventing war and preparing for it was nearly impossible to define clearly. What is certain is that Teller never stopped acting, as if the stakes were absolute. He carried the memory of Europe's collapse like a personal compass, trusting machines more than sentiments, systems more than promises, and believing that fear, guided by rational strength, could be safer than hope guided by wishful thinking. Part 4 concludes with Teller older, more famous, and more contested than ever. A man who relentlessly pursued a technological shield against history's cruelty, even as many around him questioned the pursuit itself. He had transitioned from building ultimate weapons to envisioning ultimate defenses, from laboratory brilliance to national persuasion. Part 5 will explore the final chapter of his life, his last decades, the post-Cold War assessment of his legacy, and how his story continues to challenge and illuminate the moral physics of power. The years following the Oppenheimer hearings served to sharpen Edward Teller, not mellow him. He had embarked on a path that alienated him from the camaraderie of the physics community, but placed him in close proximity to the strategic heart of America. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Teller was no longer just a designer of thermonuclear weapons. He was becoming something rarer and more divisive, a scientist who believed it was his civic duty to shape policy, not merely enable it. At Lawrence Livermore, he remained the lab's most forceful presence even after stepping down as director. Teller served as director from 1958 to 1960, a period complicated by test moratoria and the need to keep weapons work moving without actual detonations. He stepped down largely so he could argue more freely in Washington against any political boundary that might slow nuclear progress. That fight peaked around nuclear testing. Fallout anxiety was growing worldwide. Many scientists, including some who built the bombs, were now pushing for limits, believing the arms race had reached a morally intolerable speed. Teller took the opposite view. He argued that testing was the only way to guarantee safety, reliability, and superiority, and that treaties were too fragile to verify against Soviet deception. When the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed in 1963, forbidding atmospheric, underwater, and outer space tests, Teller publicly opposed it. He thought it froze the United States at a dangerous moment, while leaving too much room for cheating. To colleagues who had turned toward arms control, Teller sounded like a man trapped in wartime urgency. To Teller, they sounded like people forgetting the nature of regimes. Europe's collapse was still his private reference point. He did not live in the Cold War as an abstract chess match. He lived in it as someone who had watched democracies misread a threat before and pay for it. Around the same time, Teller threw himself into a vision that startled even some of his supporters: peaceful nuclear explosions. He became a leading champion of Project Plowshare, a federal effort to use nuclear blasts for gigantic civil engineering tasks: digging canals, carving harbors, stimulating underground gas fields. Livermore sketched dozens of schemes, and Teller's most famous was Project Chariot, a plan to detonate thermonuclear devices to create a deep water harbor on Alaska's northwest coast. In Teller's imagination, this was a moral transmutation. If nuclear technology could reshape geography for trade and prosperity, maybe the bomb would stop being only a shadow over cities. But the world pushed back. Ecologists, local Inupiat communities, and many scientists argued that radioactive contamination and social disruption would be irreversible. The project became a public scandal and was abandoned. Over the next years, Plowshare itself withered, as costs ballooned and environmental harms became undeniable. Teller took the defeat hard. Yet he did not abandon the underlying faith that nuclear energy was not evil by nature. It was a tool whose moral character depended on direction. That same belief made him an outspoken advocate for civilian nuclear power. He testified after accidents, defended reactors against public panic, and worked on safety structures in the Atomic Energy Commission. He supported inherently stable research reactor designs, such as TRIGA, built to resist runaway failure. To another generation, nuclear power symbolized risk. To Teller, it symbolized capacity, the kind of capacity he had learned, through exile, could decide whether societies lived or died. Still, deterrence remained his center of gravity. The 1960s and 70s brought nuclear brinkmanship to the edge of imagination. Berlin standoffs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam missile deployments, and the cold arithmetic of mutually assured destruction. Teller's view was grimly linear. Peace would not be ensured by goodwill. It would be ensured by credibility. And credibility, in the nuclear era, meant visible technical and strategic advantage. So he pushed for stronger arsenals, lighter deliverable warheads, and more accurate missiles. Livermore, shaped by his philosophy, became a fierce competitor to Los Alamos and a main engine of U.S. warhead innovation. The lab produced compact, high-yield designs suited to submarine and ICBM forces, and Teller served as its most relentless public face. But a shift was forming in his mind. Superiority alone still left humanity trapped in a hostage system. If both superpowers could erase each other in minutes, deterrence felt less like stability and more like standing on a bridge made of gasoline, hoping nobody lit a match. Teller's answer was not disarmament. It was defense. He had argued for active missile defenses as early as the 1960s, believing a shield could change strategy from threatening cities to protecting them. By the late 1970s, with new Soviet missiles fielded and anxiety rising in Washington, the idea found new oxygen. Teller believed technology could do what diplomacy could not: reduce the probability of catastrophe by making attacks less certain of success. This conviction carried him into the most controversial crusade of his later life, the Strategic Defense Initiative. In the early 1980s, Teller became a major scientific influence on President Ronald Reagan, who disliked a world permanently balanced on mutual annihilation. Teller and his Livermore Circle proposed space-based missile defense concepts: lasers, particle beams, and most famously the nuclear-pumped X-ray laser known as Project Excalibur. The Excalibur concept aimed to use a nuclear explosion in space to power intense X-ray beams that could strike many incoming warheads at once. It was breathtaking in ambition and terrifying in implication. In 1983, Reagan announced SDI. Supporters hailed it as a route beyond the moral ugliness of mutually assured destruction. Critics mocked it as Star Wars, calling it science fiction, and warning it would destabilize deterrence by provoking Soviet counter-races. Teller became SDI's most visible scientific evangelist. He testified, lobbied, and spoke with a fervor that felt almost spiritual, except his divinity was technological ingenuity. The backlash was fierce. Many physicists doubted SDI could work against realistic countermeasures like decoys and saturation attacks. Internal reviews suggested that key Excalibur claims were overly optimistic. Teller was accused of selling a dream to match political desire, just as he had once sold the super to match strategic fear. He rejected the accusations. He argued that radical defense research always looks impossible at first, and that failing to explore was a real irresponsibility. The SDI dispute replayed the old moral seizure point of Teller's life. His supporters believed defensive superiority could make nuclear war unlikely and help in the Cold War by exhausting Soviet resources. His critics believed it risked triggering exactly the kind of escalation the world could not survive. Either way, Teller had again placed himself on the fault line where science meets power. By the late 1980s, communism cracked. Teller watched the Soviet bloc unravel with vindication and sorrow braided together. He interpreted the collapse as proof that pressure, endurance, and technological dynamism mattered. After 1989, he returned to Hungary several times, carrying the complicated pride of an exile who had never truly stopped being shaped by the soil he escaped. Old age began slowing his body, not his voice. He lived in California, tied to Livermore as director emeritus and to Stanford's Hoover Institution as a senior fellow. Honors piled up, but so did arguments about what his life meant. Part 4 ends with Teller older, more influential, and more contested than ever. He had moved from building ultimate weapons to dreaming of ultimate defenses, from laboratory brilliance to national persuasion. The same fear that drove him out of Europe drove him forward in America. History is not gentle, so safety must be engineered. Whether that engineering saved the world or pushed it toward new cliffs, this tension will carry into the final part. Part 5 will follow Teller's last decades, the post-Cold War judgment of his legacy, and why the father of the H-bomb remains one of the most morally complicated scientists of the modern age. The Cold War ended with a kind of silence that Edward Teller had never trusted. For most of the world, the Soviet collapse felt like a door finally opening. For Teller, it felt more like a door that might slam again if people forgot why it had been locked in the first place. He welcomed the fall of communism, but he did not read it as a cue to relax. He read it as evidence that pressure, endurance, and technological advantage had mattered, perhaps even more than diplomats wanted to admit. In the early 1990s, Teller watched the nuclear world rearrange itself. The superpower standoff that had justified his lifelong urgency dissolved, but the weapons did not. Russia inherited a vast arsenal. New nuclear states emerged. Non-state threats began to occupy intelligence briefings. Teller's old fear that history is not gentle and that security can evaporate quickly didn't vanish with Soviet flags. It simply changed shape. He continued to argue that deterrence and strong defense were still necessary, now against unpredictability rather than a single rival. Yet the post-Cold War years also softened one edge of Teller's public persona, his shift toward energy and long-range survival questions. He had always defended nuclear power, but in the 1990s he spoke about it with renewed urgency. Fossil fuels, he said, could not carry civilization forever. Climate concerns were growing. Global energy demand was exploding. Teller saw nuclear technology as the only realistic bridge to a high-energy future without choking the planet. He urged investment in safer reactors, in proliferation-resistant fuel cycles, and in new designs that could make large-scale accidents far less likely. Some listeners viewed this as a late-stage redemption arc, a man associated with ultimate weapons arguing for peaceful electricity. Others saw it as consistent with everything he had always believed. Technology is neutral, and the moral duty of scientists is to aim it toward survival. Teller was never sentimental about this. He spoke the way he always had, with a kind of brisk certainty. But behind the certainty there was a quiet, aging awareness. The world might now destroy itself more easily through neglect than through war. Even after SDI's central dreams faded into a more modest missile defense reality, Teller kept advocating for research that would make nuclear attack less likely to succeed. He supported American missile defense programs into the 1990s, arguing that imperfect shields were still better than none. Critics continued to accuse him of excessive optimism about defensive breakthroughs. Supporters continued to treat him as a rare scientist willing to fight for a safer architecture rather than accept the logic of mutual hostage-taking. Age did not quiet him. It just pushed his battles onto different terrain. By then he was a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and director emeritus of Lawrence Livermore, a lab that still carried his DNA, speed, boldness, and a belief that strategic physics was a form of civic service. He wrote essays, lectured, and visited students who were young enough to know the Cold War only as history. Some of those students were surprised by how playful he could be in private. Teller loved jokes, loved piano, loved arguments that were sharp but not cruel. The hard man of public myth had always had a human interior, but he rarely displayed it where the cameras lived. He also returned, repeatedly, to Hungary after 1989. For Teller, these visits were not tourist nostalgia. They were encounters with a ghost of himself. Budapest had been the place where he learned that ideas in danger could dance in the same street. Now the city was free again. He met scientists, politicians, old acquaintances, and younger Hungarians who knew his name mostly as a controversial legend. He spoke with pride about Hungarian intellect, and with grief about the century that had scattered it. In family life, he clung to constancy. His wife, Maisai Teller, whom he had married in 1934, had been his anchor through exile, war, and the storm of his reputation. She died in 1999 after 66 years of marriage. The loss left him more fragile than he liked to show. Friends said that afterward he seemed lonelier, though still fiercely self-directed. His children and grandchildren became his main private circle, and he took real pleasure in their ordinary lives. Perhaps because his own life had rarely been allowed to be ordinary. Public judgment of Teller, in these years, was a strange double exposure. On one layer, he was honored as a giant of 20th century science. On another layer, he was criticized as a man who had pushed the world toward a precipice. Both layers were real. Biographers noted the paradox. Teller's earliest papers were contributions to pure quantum theory. His later life was dominated by the politics of survival. He was a physicist who lived in two climates at once. In one climate, his mind was elegant and abstract, producing insights on molecules, nuclear transitions, statistical models, and the very grammar of matter. In the other climate, he was a strategic warrior, convinced that the moral weight of a weapon depends on who holds it first. That paradox fed the cultural myth around him. Some journalists and artists treated him as an inspiration for Dr. Strangelove, the archetype of the brilliant but terrifying scientist who cannot see past technical possibility. Teller rejected the comparison, insisting he was not intoxicated by destruction but by security. The myth survived anyway, because Teller's certainty was story-friendly. It was sharp, dramatic, and often at odds with the doubts of his contemporaries. Even in late life, he did not retreat from the moral debate. He argued that history had rewarded his caution rather than the caution of his critics. Fascism had been beaten. Soviet expansion had been contained. Nuclear war had not happened. He believed thermonuclear strength was a guardrail. His critics argued the guardrail itself was made of explosives, and that the world had survived partly by luck rather than design. These arguments never settled, because there is no experiment that can replay history without Teller's choices. All we have is interpretation. One of Teller's last scientific preoccupations returned to energy again. In a final paper published after his death, he advocated building a prototype liquid fluoride thorium reactor, arguing that thorium fuel cycles could offer greater safety and reduce long-lived waste. It was a fitting last note, not a bomb, but a reactor, not extinction, but endurance. He was still trying to engineer survival, this time for the planet as a whole. In 2003, the U.S. government honored him with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The award ceremony was on July 23rd, and the medal was accepted on his behalf by his daughter, because health had already begun to fail. For Teller, it was a public closure of the story America preferred to tell, the refugee genius who helped defend the free world. It did not erase controversy, but it marked recognition. Barely 7 weeks later, on September 9th, 2003, Teller died in Stanford, California, after suffering a stroke 2 days earlier. He was 95 years old. What remained after him was not a clean legacy, but a charged one. The hydrogen bomb, the Teller, ULAM design, Livermore SDI, reactor safety, nuclear power advocacy, all of it sits in the modern world like a set of tools we can't uninvent. Teller's life is a story of how a man can be both a brilliant scientist and a moral storm. If you listen closely, the emotional line of his last decades is not triumph or regret. It is persistence. Teller never stopped believing that the universe is dangerous and that we owe each other protection against that danger. He did not trust history to remain kind. So he tried to build kindness out of physics, sometimes by building walls, sometimes by building shields, and near the end, by building the possibility of clean power. Whether one admires him or fears him, the face behind the legend is consistent. A refugee who looked at the 20th century and decided that survival was the highest form of responsibility.